Why is my father's 40-year ledger still taped behind the freezer in a diner that's been closed for 25 years? The question cut through courtroom silence as the judge finalized my divorce and awarded my husband the house I once believed was ours. I walked out with nothing but a rusted key to my father's forgotten diner and a deed no one bothered to read. 3 days earlier, I sat in a parking lot outside a shuttered grocery store with the engine of my old Ford truck ticking like it was counting down what little life I had left. I was 62 years old, with $214 in my checking account and a phone that had started dropping calls whenever I needed it most. The divorce papers were folded neatly in my purse, as if order could soften what they had taken from me. My husband's lawyer called it a fair settlement. I called it erasure. The house we had lived in for 31 years was now legally his. Every photograph still hanging on the walls, every coffee mug in the kitchen, even the dent in the hallway where I once dropped a ceramic bowl during an argument that nobody ever apologized for. All of it belonged to him now. What I kept, according to the paperwork, was personal effects and a property line item no one cared about. An old diner my father left behind on Route 11, sealed shut since I was in my 40s. I had not seen the place in over 2 decades. Not since the funeral. Not since I signed the last county form and promised myself I would never go back. But promises mean less when you are standing in a parking lot with nowhere to sleep and your life reduced to a single bank balance that barely covers gas and insulin refills. The diner key felt heavier than it should have been. Rust clung to its teeth like it had been waiting inside a lock that refused to forget it. I turned it over in my hand twice before placing it back into my coat pocket. Across the street, a man in a clean white shirt was locking up his office. He glanced at me once, then looked away quickly, the way people do when they decide you are someone else's problem. By late afternoon, I was driving north toward the old county road, the kind of highway where trees lean in too close and phone signals disappear without warning. The diner was supposed to be 5 miles past the grain elevator, but I remembered it before I even saw it. The broken neon sign bent like a question mark over an empty gravel lot. The building looked smaller than memory, or maybe I had just grown used to losing things. Windows were clouded with dust. The front door was chained, though the lock itself looked newer than it should have been. Someone had been here recently. Inside, through a gap in the blinds, I could see tables still standing in rows like they were waiting for a shift that never started again. The air smelled faintly of old grease and cold metal. I pressed my forehead against the glass, and that was when I saw it. Behind the counter, the freezer door was slightly ajar, and on its side, barely visible under peeling white paint, were fresh scratch marks that looked like something had been pulled away in a hurry. And taped just above the handle, half hidden in shadow, was a strip of faded paper with one word written in my father's handwriting. Ledger. The word ledger seemed to pulse under the peeling paint like it was still warm from a hand that had written it not long ago. I stepped back from the diner window slowly, my breath fogging the glass, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I clearly had. The freezer inside sat half shut, like someone had left in a hurry and never returned. My fingers tightened around the rusted key in my pocket until it bit into my skin. Behind me, the gravel lot stretched empty under a fading sky. My truck was parked crooked near the edge of the road, the engine ticking as it cooled, the same tired sound it had made for months now. I opened the driver's door and sat down without turning the key, letting the silence settle over me like weight. My purse was on the passenger seat, slightly open. From inside, the corner of my bank statement showed $214.37, exactly enough to remind me how thin survival had become. 3 days earlier, that number had already decided everything. The courthouse air had smelled like paper and polish, like decisions made too cleanly to feel human. My husband didn't even look at me when the judge spoke. He only checked his phone once, as if waiting for something more important than the end of 31 years. When it was over, the house was his. The kitchen where I burned Sunday toast. The bedroom where I folded his shirts for decades. Even the porch swing I bought with my own bonus check in 1998. All of it transferred away in language so smooth it felt like theft dressed as paperwork. My lawyer had slid the final document toward me with 2 fingers, careful not to meet my eyes. You'll need to sign here and here. No anger, no cruelty, just distance. The kind of distance that makes you feel like you're already gone. I signed. My hand didn't shake until the second page. Outside the courthouse, I had expected him to leave quickly. Instead, he lingered by his car long enough to watch me walk away with a cardboard box that contained my entire remaining life. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The silence was practiced. Now, sitting in my truck in front of my father's abandoned diner, I felt that same silence again, but heavier. My phone buzzed once with a reminder. Rent due, final notice. I didn't open it. There was no point. The landlord had already made it clear 2 weeks ago. No extension, no exceptions. My name would be out of the system by the end of the month whether I packed or not. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a folded envelope of cash. Gas receipts, pharmacy receipts, coins wrapped in paper. Everything I had left organized into small acts of denial. It wasn't enough for anything stable. Not rent. Not repairs. Not even dignity if dignity had a price tag. The diner sat just beyond the windshield, its broken sign swaying slightly in the wind. For a moment, I thought about turning the key and driving away like I had for 20 years. That was the pattern, leave before anything could finish breaking you. But then I looked again at the freezer through the window. The scratch marks near the handle weren't old. They were too sharp, too clean. Someone had been there recently. Someone had wanted something out or wanted something hidden. My gaze drifted down to the deed I had pulled from my purse without realizing it. The paper was creased, softened by years of being ignored. And for the first time, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. A faint correction stamped over the parcel number, like someone had tried to rewrite where this place truly belonged. The diner wasn't just abandoned. It had been changed. Quietly, officially. And whatever had been hidden behind that freezer wasn't waiting by accident. It was waiting because someone made sure I would be the one to find it. The deed in my hands felt lighter than paper but heavier than everything I had lost. The inked correction on the parcel number still caught my eye, like a mistake someone had tried to erase but failed halfway through. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, staring through the cracked windshield at the diner's broken neon sign swaying in the wind, repeating one sentence in my head. This place was not forgotten by accident. 3 days earlier, I thought I was done with anything that required believing in second chances. But the courthouse had other plans. My husband's attorney spoke first, sliding a stack of documents across the polished table like they were nothing more than receipts. The marital residence is awarded entirely to Mr. Carter. No further claims are permitted. His tone made it sound like closing a business account, not ending a life. When I asked about my father's property, he didn't even open the file fully. He flipped it once, glanced at a single line, and exhaled. This diner is classified as non-performing real estate. No revenue history. No tenants. No valuation. Frankly, it's a liability. He pushed it back toward me like something sticky. If you want it, you can take it. Nobody else will. Nobody else will. The words followed me out of the courthouse like a shadow. By the time I reached the county clerk's office, the afternoon light had turned dull, the kind of gray that makes everything look already abandoned. The clerk was an older woman with glasses hanging low on her nose. She didn't smile when I handed her the file. She just looked at the name on the deed for a long second longer than necessary. "Old Miller Diner?" she asked, flipping through a thick binder of property records. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I remembered. She paused at the page, her finger hovering over a faded map. A small red circle marked the location like someone had drawn it years ago and never returned to confirm it still mattered. "Haven't seen anyone touch this file in over a decade," she murmured. Taxes were barely covered by the county. Most people forgot it existed. Most people. Not all. When she slid the deed across the counter, the paper felt warm from passing through too many hands. The clerk hesitated again, just for a moment. "You sure you want this?" It wasn't a question about paperwork. It was something else. Something closer to warning. Outside, the wind had picked up. I stood on the steps of the building, the deed pressed flat against my palm, and tried to calculate what I still had left. $214.37 in the bank. Half a tank of gas. A truck with a transmission that slipped when it rained. And a house I no longer owned. The diner was 38 miles out on Route 11. According to the clerk's map, it sat past an old grain elevator that hadn't operated since the early 2000s. "Road gets rough out there," she had said without looking up. "Most folks don't go past it unless they have a reason." I wasn't sure I had one, but I turned the key anyway. The drive pulled me farther away from everything I had known until the radio stopped catching stations and the road narrowed into something older than memory. At one point, I passed a faded auction sign nailed to a telephone pole. "County surplus auction. All items sold as is." Beneath it, someone had scribbled in marker, "Even the junk is gone." When I finally saw the diner sign again, it was worse than I remembered. One letter had fallen off completely, leaving a gap where the name should have been. The gravel lot was cracked with weeds pushing through like they were reclaiming it one root at a time. I parked at the edge, engine still running, and looked at the key in my hand. It didn't match anything modern. The metal was uneven, slightly bent near the teeth, as if it had been used too many times in a lock that no longer existed. And yet, when I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel, circling the back of the building, stopping exactly where the freezer would be inside. Someone had been here recently, and whatever they were looking for, they hadn't found it yet. Not fully. I tightened my grip on the key, feeling the weight of something I couldn't name, and realized the diner wasn't waiting to be reopened. It was waiting to be claimed. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped away from the truck, the key still warm in my hand like it didn't belong to the present time. The diner loomed closer with every step, its broken sign creaking softly in the wind. One missing letter turning the name into something incomplete, like the place itself had forgotten what it used to be called. The front door chain hung loose, not locked, just wrapped, as if whoever left last had expected to return soon. I slid the key in anyway. It didn't fit cleanly. It resisted, like metal refusing memory, until I adjusted the angle and forced it with a slow turn. The lock gave a dry metallic cough. The door opened with a long, tired groan that echoed deeper inside than I expected. Cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of old grease, dust, and something faintly metallic underneath, like forgotten coins buried in wood. I stepped in slowly. The floorboards answered under my weight with soft, uneven creaks, each one sounding like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Light filtered through blinds that were still hanging in strips across the front windows. Everything inside was frozen in a version of time that had stopped mid-shift. Booths lined the walls, their red vinyl cracked and peeling like dried skin. A coffee mug still sat behind the counter, its rim stained brown, a spoon resting inside it as if someone had just stepped away to refill it. A faded calendar hung crooked on the wall. March of a year I couldn't quite read, numbers half blurred by humidity and neglect. I set my small cardboard box down on the floor near the entrance. Felt absurdly loud in the silence. Inside it were the only things I had brought. A sweater, a bottle of water, a half-empty packet of crackers, and the folded deed that still didn't feel real in my hands. I exhaled slowly, listening to the building breathe back at me through its cracks. The counter stretched ahead like a barrier between memory and whatever came next. Behind it, shelves still held faded syrup bottles and empty jars lined up with strange discipline. Someone had once cared about order here. That much was obvious. Even the salt shakers were still paired neatly at each table, as if waiting for hands that would never return. I moved deeper, stepping carefully around a loose section of floorboard that dipped slightly under my weight. The sound it made was different, hollow, like something beneath it wasn't solid. I paused, pressing my boot down again. The wood answered with a faint echo. Not just decay. Space. A small radio sat near the register, its plastic casing yellowed with age. I tapped it lightly. Nothing. But the power cord behind it had been recently unplugged, not cut or broken. That detail sat with me longer than it should have. I worked instinctively after that. Years of being alone teach you habits you don't think about. I checked the back door first, still chained from the inside, but the chain itself looked newer than the rusted bolt it hung from. I tested a light switch. Nothing. I found a small corner near the kitchen where the roof leaked just enough to leave a dark stain on the tile, and I dragged an old stool beneath it, using it as a marker of where not to stand. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, no signal. It died almost immediately after lighting up. I tried anyway, dialing the last number that had called me, but the line didn't even ring. Just silence. I slid the phone back into my coat and tightened it around my shoulders. On one of the back tables, I noticed something that didn't belong to the same layer of dust as everything else. A faint smear, like someone had dragged something heavy across it recently. Not years ago. Weeks, maybe less. I leaned closer. Beneath the dust, barely visible, was a second line carved into the wood. Too straight, too deliberate to be accidental. Pointed not outward, but toward the back wall. And as I stood there, the diner settled around me again, quieter than before, until somewhere behind the freezer, something inside the walls shifted with a slow, deliberate scrape, as if it knew I had finally arrived. The first thing I did was move the stool away from the hollow floorboard. Like distance alone could make the sound stop replaying in my mind. The diner had shifted from abandoned to occupied in a way I couldn't explain yet. Still empty of people, but no longer empty of intention. I pulled the cardboard box closer to the counter, then sat on the cold tile long enough to feel the dampness seep through my jeans. My phone blinked once, 2% battery, and then dimmed again like it was giving up with me. I started where anyone trying to survive would start, making space. Behind the counter, I found a broom leaning at an angle, its bristles hardened with years of dust. I used it anyway, sweeping broken glass from a corner window that had collapsed inward. Each scrape against the floor sounded too loud, like the building was remembering every movement I made. I worked slowly, not because I had time, but because my body refused anything faster. My hands had begun to ache already, the skin on my knuckles dry and tight from cold air and constant friction. I dragged an old tarp from the storage room and climbed onto a metal chair to stretch it across a section of the ceiling where water had been dripping steadily. The plastic cracked as I pulled it tight, but it held when I duct taped it to the rafters. Rain had started outside, soft at first, then steady, tapping against the roof in uneven rhythm. Inside, the tarp turned that sound into something hollow and controlled, like a heartbeat trying to stabilize. I checked what worked. One faucet in the back still ran, though the water came out brown for a few seconds before clearing into something barely usable. I filled a metal pot and set it on a camping burner I pulled from my truck, waiting for it to boil while I wiped down the front counter. The cloth turned gray almost immediately, revealing layers of old syrup stains and something darker beneath the wood grain. There were moments where my body moved on its own, like muscle memory from another life. I tightened a loose cabinet hinge. I propped a broken chair leg with folded cardboard. I even fixed a jammed lock on the back door by pressing the mechanism just right with a screwdriver I found in a drawer. These were not repairs. They were negotiations with collapse. At one point, I paused to breathe and noticed my reflection in the glass of a cracked pie display case. I barely recognized the woman staring back. My hair had come loose from its clip, my coat dusted with drywall powder, my hands trembling slightly from effort more than fear. In my pocket was a folded hospital bill I hadn't opened in weeks. While cleaning under the counter, I found an old receipt stuck between two boards. It was yellowed, edges curled, but the ink was still legible. It wasn't from the diner's register. The name printed at the top wasn't mine, and it wasn't my father's either. It belonged to someone I had never heard of, signed off on equipment delivery dated 5 years after the diner had officially closed. That didn't make sense. I told myself it must have been leftover paperwork, something forgotten during an inspection or a repair visit. Places like this collect history the way abandoned cars collect rust, layer by layer without asking permission. Still, I folded the receipt and placed it in my coat pocket instead of throwing it away. Later, while wiping down the counter edge, my cloth caught on something sharp. I pulled back and found it. An old key, wedged deep in a crack beneath the wood trim. It wasn't the diner key I had used to get in. It was smaller, newer in shape, almost deliberately hidden where no one would see it during cleaning. I turned it over in my hand. It didn't match any visible lock in the front area. Not the doors, not the cabinets, not the register drawer. It looked like it belonged somewhere I hadn't reached yet. Somewhere built to stay unseen even during cleanup. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming harder against the roof, and for a moment the diner felt less empty, like something behind the walls was shifting just slightly closer, adjusting to the fact that I was still here, still cleaning, still not leaving. Looked toward the back wall again, toward the direction of the freezer, and noticed something new. A section of paneling that had begun to separate just enough to show a thin, dark line that hadn't been visible before the sweeping began. The door creaked again, this time behind me. I turned to see a man standing at the threshold, ladder slung over his shoulder and a small brown paper bag dangling from his hand. His hat was pulled low, but the lines in his face betrayed decades of hands-on labor. "I thought I'd bring you some essentials," he said quietly, setting the bag on the counter. Cans of soup, a bag of coffee, and a small pack of matches. I nodded, unsure if gratitude or suspicion should come first. "I knew your father," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the broken refrigerator. "He helped people here, more than anyone remembered." His eyes flicked toward the corner near the freezer, then away. He didn't elaborate. I noticed the crease in his brow when he mentioned a year, 1958, and he exhaled quickly, like pushing air through a straw. I crossed the counter to examine the bag he had left. Among the groceries, tucked beneath a can of beans, was a receipt from the hardware store downtown. The same store my father had gone to for nails, screws, and ledger bindings over decades. I lifted it and recognized the handwriting. The clerk's scrawl matched a note in one of the old ledgers I had glimpsed in Part 4. I mentioned it aloud. "You see that?" I asked, pointing. He looked, then smiled faintly. "That's from the last order your father made before." His voice caught and he shook his head. "Never mind. You're the one who has to deal with it now." I asked about the ledger, about the key I had found wedged beneath the counter. He glanced at both, then nodded slightly. "Your father kept things for a reason. People came here, people left. Some things stayed hidden so only the right hands would ever touch them." His gaze lingered on the key, the same one I had tried in the front door earlier. It was clear he recognized it, and recognition didn't come without memory. He moved closer to the freezer, running a finger along its chipped edge, his hand steady. "Despite age, I used to help him maintain this place when the pumps were still working. I remember nights when the rain came down in sheets and he'd let kids in from the street. Quiet things, little things. Nobody ever knew." I listened, letting the damp smell of the diner and the hiss of the heater fill the silence. It struck me that this place had been alive, even when it looked dead. The counters, the booths, even the cracked glass. All remnants of work, care, and history. Before leaving, he handed me a folded slip of paper with a phone number scribbled hastily. "Call if you need parts, tools, or just advice," he said. His eyes held something heavier than concern, memory, respect, a warning. "And don't let anyone tell you what's worthless here." He paused at the door, glanced back at me, then added softly, "Some things are meant for the right hands only." I folded the paper slowly, feeling the weight of it in my palm. His visit left more than supplies. It left confirmation that the diner, this decaying building, still had a pulse, a history, and a purpose I hadn't yet fully grasped. The ledger, the key, the receipt, they were parts of that living past. And as he stepped out into the rain, the sound of his boots on the gravel seemed to echo in rhythm with the heartbeat of a place that had been waiting, silently, for me. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, tapping against the metal roof in uneven patterns as I moved through the diner with my flashlight. Its beam cut through the dust-filled air, landing on the cracked vinyl booths, the faded menu pinned crookedly to the wall, and the counter that still held the faint scent of coffee grounds from decades past. I knelt near the back, examining the floorboards where the hollow echo beneath my knees had first drawn my attention. A faint scrape line ran from the base of the counter toward the freezer, like someone had dragged something heavy along the floor. I traced it with my finger, feeling the slight groove beneath the dust. At first, I told myself it was just old furniture settling, metal dragging against wood. I stepped closer to the freezer, letting my hand slide along its edge. The surface felt cooler than the surrounding metal, and when I tapped it with my knuckle, the hollow thrum echoed differently than the rest of the appliance. I crouched and ran my flashlight along the side, noticing a small panel that had been painted over in a shade slightly lighter than the wall. My first instinct was to think it was a patch job from years ago. But something about the stroke of the brush looked deliberate, precise. The locker near the corner caught my attention next. I had noticed it before, dented and rusted, but today I saw that one of the screws holding it in place was reversed. The threading pointed inward rather than outward. I crouched and tapped it with a screwdriver, listening to the faint hollow clang behind it. For a moment, I imagined it was just poor construction, an accident of neglect. But the more I inspected, the more the inconsistencies added up. The floorboard beneath the booth near the wall was a different grain, newer than the others, with slight burn marks on the edges as if someone had sanded it down recently. The paint on the baseboards was cracked differently here, too, the brush strokes not matching the rest of the trim. A soft hiss came from the old refrigerator in the corner, groaning like it had been turned on after decades of silence. I paused, listening, then moved toward it, shining the flashlight across its coils. A thin wire ran along the wall and disappeared behind the freezer, leading to a small gap where the panel and wall met. My heart thumped as I crouched lower to get a closer look, brushing the dust away. The wire wasn't part of any appliance I could recognize. It ended at nothing visible, dangling in the air for a fraction of an inch before vanishing behind the wall. Outside, the faint outline of a car moved through the mist on the gravel lot, but I ignored it, focusing instead on the sequence of oddities inside. Each anomaly, floorboards, panel, locker, wire, formed a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. I pulled out the deed again from my coat pocket and compared the parcel number to the map I had seen earlier. There was a small circle, just barely noticeable, in the same corner of the property boundary, as if someone had marked where to look, leaving a silent breadcrumb for whoever cared to notice. I shined the flashlight along the wall once more and noticed a small crack in the base of the panel near the freezer, just wide enough for a fingertip. My fingers itched to probe it, to see what lay beneath, but I paused. The pattern was clear now. Every irregularity led toward this corner. Every hollow sound, every difference in paint and wood, pointed to one place. And as I crouched there, the rain tapping steadily above, a faint, deliberate scratch from behind the panel echoed through the diner, confirming that something had been deliberately hidden, waiting for me to find it. My fingers lingered on the edge of the panel near the freezer, brushing away decades of dust until the wood felt warm from unseen friction. I pressed the small crack with a screwdriver, nudging it gently until it gave way with a reluctant pop. Behind it was a narrow cavity, just wide enough to slide my hand inside. The air smelled faintly of oil and old paper, a scent that immediately reminded me of my father's workshop. I reached in carefully and pulled out a worn, leather-bound ledger. Its spine was creased, the corners frayed, and a faint brown stain marred the bottom edge like a coffee spill long forgotten. I inhaled slowly, letting the smell of aged leather and ink fill my lungs before gingerly placing it on the floor beside me. I sat cross-legged and opened the first page, brushing off the dust and squinting at the handwriting, small and precise, yet shaky in spots. A date jumped out at me, March 12, 1978. Beneath it, a name I knew immediately, though I hadn't expected to see it here. My father's old friend, the mechanic who had helped him maintain the diner pumps. The entry listed transactions, small loans, and notes on people who had worked in the town long before I was born. One line, in particular, froze me. An address matching the very diner I sat in, but dated years after it was supposed to have been closed. My pulse quickened as I traced the letters with my finger, noticing the same correction style I had seen on the deed months ago. A faint scrap of paper, folded and stuck between two pages, fell into my lap. It was an envelope, yellowed and sealed with a wax stamp cracked down the middle. I held it carefully, recognizing the initials, the same ones my father had used on ledgers, receipts, and notes across years of meticulous record-keeping. My hands shook as I lifted the flap and peeked inside. There was a single Polaroid, edges curling, showing a group of people outside the diner, all smiling, some faces blurred with age. And there, unmistakably, my father stood at the center, holding a small, young child whose features mirrored my own. I paused to catch my breath, running a hand through my hair. I could feel the weight of time pressing down, a pressure that made my knees ache against the hard tile. The ledger's pages whispered secrets I hadn't yet earned the right to fully understand. I flipped to the next entry slowly. Numbers repeated, loans, payments, a ledger balance that didn't make sense, and my eyes caught a signature altered subtly, as if someone had corrected it decades ago. Who would have done this and why? I folded the envelope back carefully and pressed it against my chest, letting my knees absorb the shivering of anticipation and disbelief. Somewhere in the corner, the fridge hissed, the lights flickered, and the rain pattered softly on the roof, marking the passage of time without revealing it. I knew I had to hide this discovery before anyone else appeared, even the friendly mechanic from earlier, because the ledger wasn't just an old book. It was a map of choices, debts, favors, and secrets. And as I turned back to the page, my eyes fell on a line that made me stop breathing completely. My own name, written in my father's familiar hand, beside a date I could never forget. The ledger lay open on the floor between my knees, its leather cover cold and worn, the pages trembling slightly under my fingers as if they remembered every hand that had touched them before me. I traced the handwriting carefully, noting the names of people who had lived and worked in the town long before I could. Receipts tucked between the pages, faded and yellowed, listed payments my father had quietly made for medical bills, rent, and supplies. Debts settled in. Secret for families who never asked for help. Each note had a date, an amount, and a small scrawl of acknowledgement. Initials, sometimes a smiley face, sometimes just a dash. I reached for a small envelope folded into the ledger's spine. Inside was a letter never mailed, the ink slightly smeared, smelling faintly of tobacco and soap. My father's precise hand listed out who he had helped over the years. A child needing medication, a widow struggling to pay rent, a neighbor facing foreclosure. I could feel the paper crinkle under my fingers, as if it were alive, pulsing with the quiet life of someone who had spent decades trying to protect others without being seen. I ran my hand across a photograph sandwiched between two pages. It was a black and white image of the diner in its prime, my father behind the counter, smiling at a young man holding a toolbox. My eyes adjusted to the faint light spilling from the broken ceiling fixture, and I could almost hear the shuffle of shoes, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the old fridge running. It smelled faintly of oil and old coffee, a memory embedded in the paper. As I flipped further, I found names I recognized from the local church registry, handwritten notes indicating donations my father had made in cash to families in need, and signed by anyone but himself. One entry mentioned a young mother, a nurse, who had been forced to work double shifts to pay for her son's treatment. The ledger noted the exact amount, the hospital, and the date of payment. My chest tightened. He had been watching, helping, keeping accounts, always from the shadows. A scrap of receipt fell from between the pages, listing hardware supplies with the same dates as entries in the ledger. I paused, realizing the same names appeared over and over, often with a parenthetical note. Handle quietly. Do not tell Mr. Mlin. Keep this safe. Each note hinted at a reason he had concealed these transactions, as if some eyes were always watching and some people would have taken everything if they knew. I leaned back against the cracked vinyl booth, my fingers brushing against the ledger as I exhaled slowly. The weight of all this hidden life pressed into me, mixing pride and grief with a tremor of fear. Why had he never told anyone? Who would have punished him or benefited if these acts had been discovered? I shivered slightly as I compared a Polaroid of the diner from decades ago with the current wreckage, seeing the same counters, the same freezer where the ledger had been hidden. And then I noticed it. One page, folded differently, had my name written beside a date that didn't make sense. Years before I could remember being anywhere near this town. My father had included me here, silently, invisibly, arranging a path that only I could follow. He hadn't forgotten me. He had left me breadcrumbs leading straight into a truth no one else had dared uncover. The moment I saw my name written in my father's handwriting inside the ledger, something in me shifted, like a lock inside my chest had turned without a key. I stayed sitting on the cold diner floor long after the rain outside had stopped, listening to the building settle around me. But silence no longer felt empty, felt occupied, like something had finally been disturbed after years of waiting. I took photographs of every page with my phone, even as the battery dropped to 1%. Then I wrapped the ledger in my coat and drove the 18 miles into town, ignoring the low fuel warning blinking on the dashboard. The county records office was already half closed when I arrived, fluorescent lights buzzing like tired insects above the counter. The clerk didn't look up when I slid the deed across the glass. "Old Miller Diner parcel," I said. My voice felt unfamiliar. She scanned the document, then paused. A second longer than normal. Her eyes flicked up, then back down. "This file was flagged," she said carefully. "Not for public review." That sentence changed the air in the room. She turned the monitor slightly toward me anyway. The parcel number matched the ledger exactly, but beneath it was something new. A notation for restricted land easement and a secondary ownership structure tied to a trust account I had never heard of. A trust that had been updated multiple times in the last 20 years. Always renewed, never dissolved, always active. My throat tightened. "Who controls the trust?" I asked. The clerk hesitated before answering. "Technically, no one listed publicly, but payments still go through a private holding account tied to this property." She glanced at me again, this time with something closer to concern. "Ma'am, this diner isn't just land. It's part of something much larger." I photographed the screen before she could change her mind. My hands were steady, but only because they had gone numb. Outside, the sky had darkened again. When I reached my truck, I noticed a black SUV parked 2 rows away that hadn't been there before. The engine was running, though no one stepped out. I told myself it meant nothing. People come and go from county buildings all the time. But my phone vibrated before I could leave. "Unknown number. We can help you understand what you're holding," the message read. "That property is unsafe. It should be transferred before things get complicated." No name. No signature. Just certainty dressed as concern. I drove back toward the diner anyway, the ledger pressed against the passenger seat like it was heavier than paper should be. When I arrived, the tire tracks I had noticed earlier were still fresh, but now there were more. New ones cutting across the gravel, circling wider, as if someone had returned to confirm something. Inside, I set the ledger on the counter and compared it again with the county record photos. Same parcel, same boundaries. But now there was a second layer, notations referencing mineral rights and a historic land agreement buried under corporate transfer documents from decades ago. My father hadn't just owned a diner. He had been sitting on land structured in legal layers I couldn't fully understand yet, but I could feel the weight of what it meant. This wasn't abandoned property. It was contained property, protected, watched. A knock echoed from the front door, sharp and deliberate. When I turned, I saw a man standing outside in a clean coat, holding a folder already open in his hand. His voice was calm when he spoke through the glass. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding about this property. If you cooperate, we can make sure you're compensated fairly before this escalates." And as I looked down at the open folder through the glass, I saw the word that made my stomach drop. My father's name stamped beside a valuation that didn't belong to anything anyone had ever called a junk diner. The man outside the diner didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. He simply held the folder higher against the glass, as if the paper itself carried authority stronger than any conversation. Inside it, I could see stamped pages, official seals, and a valuation sheet that looked far too clean for something that had been rotting for decades. The number beside my father's name didn't belong to anything I had ever stepped into before tonight. When I opened the door, the cold air rushed in between us. He stayed composed, like someone used to closing deals that didn't require agreement. "My name is Daniel Hargrove," he said evenly. I represent a redevelopment consortium interested in the property you're currently occupying. His tone wasn't hostile. It was procedural. The kind of voice that had already decided what would happen next. I didn't invite him in, but he stepped just far enough to avoid the rain. Behind him, I noticed another vehicle idling at the edge of the lot. This one had no markings, no visible plates from this distance. I think there's been a misunderstanding, he continued, flipping one page toward me but not letting go of it. This land was incorrectly classified as inactive for years. Recent review has determined it contains assets of significant value. Mineral rights, historical commercial rights, potential development corridor access. Each phrase landed like something carefully measured, not discovered. I kept one hand on the counter behind me where the ledger still sat beneath a cloth. I had not let it leave my sight since the county office. Daniel noticed where my attention drifted, but didn't comment. Instead, he slid a second document forward, an offer letter. We are prepared to resolve this quickly. Above market valuation. Immediate transfer. No legal complications. He paused just long enough to make it sound generous. Frankly, this is for your protection as much as ours. The structure here is not up to current safety code. If inspectors come through, the county will have no choice but to issue a closure order. Closure order. The phrase sounded softer than eviction, but meant the same thing in practice. Behind him, rainwater traced down the diner windows in uneven lines. I noticed how carefully he avoided looking at the freezer area, as if he already knew what might be behind it but didn't want to acknowledge how I might be closer to it than he expected. I need to verify something, I said finally. My voice came out steadier than I felt. He nodded as if he expected that answer. Of course, but I should mention time is sensitive. We've already had inquiries from other parties. If this escalates into dispute, the property may be temporarily secured pending litigation. Secured. Another word that meant taken. Just dressed differently. When he turned slightly, I saw a second name on the corner of his file. A legal assistant's signature. Below it, a timestamp from 3 days ago, before I had even opened the freezer panel. That detail stayed in my mind longer than anything else he said. I reached behind the counter slowly and pulled out my phone, pretending to review the documents while actually photographing every page he had brought. My hand shook once, then steadied. I made sure to capture the timestamp, the valuation line, and the faint watermark on the corner that didn't match county formatting. Daniel didn't stop me. He didn't need to. People like him didn't worry about copies. They worried about originals. When I set the phone down, I said nothing about signing. He exhaled softly, almost disappointed. Take the night, he said. But understand this isn't just property. It's a liability now that its value is known. He stepped back toward the door. And liabilities don't stay unclaimed for long. The door closed behind him with a controlled click, not a slam. I stood there long after his taillights faded, then walked back to the counter and lifted the cloth covering the ledger. One page felt thinner than the rest, almost torn cleanly from its binding. I flipped through carefully and realized something that made my stomach tighten. One entry was missing, entirely, a full page removed, and on the counter beside it, left behind without him noticing, was a business card. Not his, someone else's. A witness name printed in small black text, already circled in pen, as if someone had been waiting for me to find exactly that omission. The courthouse felt colder than I remembered, like the air itself had been waiting for this moment. The ledger was inside my coat, pressed against my ribs, its weight no longer symbolic but procedural, like evidence that had finally learned how to breathe. Daniel Hargrove stood on the opposite side of the room with the same controlled posture he had at the diner, but something in his face had changed. Not fear yet. Calculation. The hearing began with paperwork. Always paperwork first. This is a dispute regarding title classification and asset valuation, the county attorney said, adjusting his glasses. We are here to determine whether the property in question holds enforceable historical, commercial, and mineral rights. He made it sound abstract. Safe. Contained. Then I placed the ledger on the table. The sound it made when it touched wood was small, almost fragile. But the room reacted anyway. A pause spread across the officials like a ripple no one admitted to noticing. I opened to the missing section, the page I had found torn, now partially reconstructed through photocopies and supporting entries I had cross-referenced through the clerk's office. "I want this entered into record," I said. My voice didn't shake. "Not anymore." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "That document is incomplete," he said calmly. "It contains unverified annotations from a private individual with no legal standing in current zoning review." No one responded immediately, but I saw the clerk at the back of the room lower her pen. "Not right. Lower it." Then I placed the second piece of evidence. The witness card. The man from the diner. His signature matched an entry in the ledger dated 23 years earlier. "He confirmed maintenance access and operational continuity," I said. "That means the property was never legally inactive. It was only misclassified." A murmur moved through the room. Daniel's assistant shifted in her seat. "Even if that were true," she interjected carefully, "there are still unresolved compliance issues, structural integrity, environmental exposure." I didn't raise my voice. I simply slid forward the photograph. The diner in its operational years. Behind the counter, my father. And beside him, the same man who had testified, younger, holding repair tools. The building wasn't abandoned. It had been functioning under a different record entirely. The room went quiet in a different way after that. Not silence. Absorption. Daniel tried again, softer now. "Even if informal activity occurred, none of this overrides current development rights acquired in good faith." That was when the county records supervisor spoke for the first time. She turned her monitor toward the room without standing. "There's an issue," she said. "The deed submitted during last year's review has a secondary signature layer. It was never validated through proper county authentication." Her finger hovered over the screen, then clicked. A scanned copy appeared. The original deed. My father's name. And beneath it, another signature. Not his, not mine. A third party. One I had seen once before on a business card left behind in the diner. Daniel went still. Just for a second. But it was enough. "That's a clerical artifact," he said quickly. "Old filing inconsistency." "No," the clerk interrupted quietly. She had stood without realizing it. "That signature was added after transfer submission. It invalidates the entire ownership claim chain." The pen in front of Daniel's assistant stopped midair. For the first time, Daniel looked directly at me. Not at the documents. At me. "You don't understand what you're stepping into," he said, lower now. Controlled, but fraying at the edges. "This property is tied to agreements far larger than this county. You're holding something that was never meant to be reopened." But the ledger was already open in front of them. The witness statement already entered. The photo already recognized. And then the county supervisor spoke again, quieter this time. "If this signature is confirmed, the entire transfer sequence is void." No one moved. No one spoke. Even the air felt paused. I closed the ledger gently, not like a victory, but like something finally being put down after being carried too long. The judge hadn't even ruled yet, but the balance had already shifted. Not by force, by record, by truth that had been buried too long to stay buried any longer. And as I looked across the table at Daniel's now silent file, I realized the part no one had said out loud yet. This wasn't just about ownership anymore. It was about what would be done with everything my father had hidden, now that the world could finally see it. The final decision didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived like silence being officially recorded. The judge lowered the document after reviewing the chain of signatures, the witness verification, and the county correction logs that had been hidden in plain filing systems for decades. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the air felt suspended, like the room itself was waiting to see which version of history would survive. Then the ruling came. The court recognizes the original transfer of title as improperly executed and subsequently altered without authorization, the judge said, voice steady but heavier now. Effective immediately, The contested property reverts to the rightful estate designation under the original trust. My father's name was restored on paper before anything else changed in the room. I felt it more than I heard it, like something broken in time had finally been aligned again. Daniel Hargrove didn't protest. Not at first. He simply sat back, looking at the ledger on the table as if it had turned into something unfamiliar. Something that no longer behaved like a document. "There will be review," he said carefully, regaining composure. "Appeals. Regulatory clarification. This is not final in practical terms." But the clerk from county records spoke before he could continue. "It is final in record terms," she said. "And that is what governs ownership." The difference between those two kinds of finality filled the room completely. Outside the courthouse windows, the afternoon light had shifted, softer now, almost warm. It felt impossible that the same air had carried tension only minutes earlier. The judge continued, addressing the ledger specifically. "The documented history within this record establishes consistent community support transactions tied to this property and confirms active, undisclosed operational use. That history must now be preserved under estate protection guidelines." Estate protection. Not demolition. Not seizure. Preservation. For the first time, I understood what my father had actually built. Not just a diner. Not just land. But something that had survived quietly through paperwork, through people, through years no one thought would matter anymore. Daniel finally stood. His movements were slower now, less certain. "My client will need time to reassess exposure," he said, gathering his files. The words were still professional, but the weight behind them had changed. We were operating under incomplete disclosure. No one corrected him. They didn't need to. When he left, there was no victory announcement. No applause. Just the sound of paper being filed correctly for the first time in decades. Later, outside the courthouse steps, I stood with the ledger pressed against my chest. The wind had shifted again, carrying the smell of rain and pavement warming under late sun. The man from the diner, my father's old friend, was waiting near the edge of the parking lot. He didn't smile, but his shoulders looked lighter than before. "It's done," he said simply. Not like celebration, like completion. The diner reopened 3 weeks later. Not as a redevelopment site, not as a property under review, but as what it had always been underneath everything else. Open land, open memory, open work. The sign above the door was repaired with the same uneven letters I remembered from childhood. Now cleaned but not replaced. People came slowly at first. The same faces the ledger had mentioned. The same names my father had written down decades earlier when no one else was paying attention. They brought chairs, tools, old photographs, things they had been holding on to without knowing why. I placed my father's photograph on the counter where he used to stand. The wood beneath it still carried faint grooves from years of movement. Hands, cups, change, life. The key no longer felt like something hidden. The deed no longer felt like something stolen. The ledger no longer felt like a secret. It felt like proof that nothing here had ever truly been worthless, only waiting for the right moment to be understood. And as I locked the diner for the first time not as a visitor, but as someone staying, the late light spilled across the floorboards like a quiet promise finally kept. A place once abandoned now breathing again, not because it was saved, but because it was never truly lost.